Greetings, listeners. We're back, once again, to talk to you about the Cthulhu mythos, its books, its monsters, its unfortunate human casualties, its timeline in general, and even its tangential bits, like the Dreamlands, or things of a weird nature, or things that are Lovecraftian leaning, weird fiction, science fiction, horror, learn of terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins and vast staircases that lead down to abysses of nighted secrets, of complex angles that lead through invisible walls to other regions of space and time, and of hideous explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds, and in different time-space continua. From the creation of our galaxy to the death of the sun, this is an exploration of the Cthulhu mythos from the perspective of humans' concept of history. We are the People's Guide to the Cthulhu mythos. You can find us at pgttcm.com, pgttcm.podbean.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. The People's Guide to the Cthulhu mythos starts now.
The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Season 8.
Greetings and welcome to The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. I am your host, D.B. Spitzer, and between episodes, 107 and 134, we will be talking about The Beetle. The Beetle, a Mystery, is a 1897 horror novel by British writer Richard Marsh. To tell you about it is to spoil it. So check it out, and that'll be going on from now until sometime in December. This episode is brought to you by FoundOutOnClothing.com and BunnySlippers.com. Subscribe to PGTTCM with DB Spitzer and Seraphy. Wherever you subscribe to podcasts, we prefer Podbean and Apple Podcasts. Check out the new website over at pgttcm.com and check out the merch table over at pgttcm.threadless.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at PGTTCM, or check us out on YouTube at People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, edited by Daniel Spitzer. Music by Kevin MacLeod, featuring The Hive, Ghost Story, Ghost Processional, Oppressive Gloom, and our theme song, The Chamber.
Chapter 19, The Lady Rages. Dora Grayling stood in the doorway. I told your servant he need not trouble to show me in, and I've come without my aunt. I hope I'm not intruding. She was, confoundedly, and it was on the tip of my tongue to tell her so. She came into the room with twinkling eyes, looking radiantly happy. That sort of look which makes even a plain young woman prepossessing. Am I intruding? I believe I am. She held out her hand, while she was still a dozen feet away, and when I did not dash forward to make a clutch at it, she shook her head and made a little mouth at me. What's the matter with you? Aren't you well? I was not well. I was very far from well. I was as unwell as I could be without being positively ill, and any person of common discernment would have perceived it at a glance. At the same time, I was not going to admit anything of the kind to her. Thank you. I am perfectly well. Then, if I were you, I would endeavor to become imperfectly well. A little imperfection in that direction might make you appear to more advantage. I am afraid that I am not one of those persons who ever do appear to much advantage. Did I not tell you so last night? I believe you did say something of the kind. It's very good of you to remember. Have you forgotten something else which you said to me last night? You can hardly expect me to keep fresh in my memory all the follies of which my tongue is guilty. Thank you. That is quite enough. Good day. She turned as if to go. Miss Grayling. Mr. Atherton. What's the matter? What have I been saying now? Last night you invited me to come and see you this morning. Is that one of the follies of which your tongue was guilty? The engagement had escaped my recollection, it is a fact, and my face betrayed me. You had forgotten? Her cheeks flamed, her eyes sparkled. You must pardon my stupidity for not having understood that the invitation was of that general kind which is never meant to be acted on. She was halfway to the door before I stopped her. I had to take her by the shoulder to do it. Miss Grayling, you are hard on me. I suppose I am. Is anything harder than to be intruded on by an undesired and unexpected guest? Now you are harder still. If you knew what I have gone through since our conversation of last night, in your strength you would be merciful. Indeed? What have you gone through? I hesitated. What I actually had gone through I certainly did not propose to tell her. Other reasons apart, I did not desire to seem madder than I admittedly am, and I lacked sufficient plausibility to enable me to concoct, on the spur of the moment, a plain tale of the doings of my midnight visitor which would have suggested that the narrator was perfectly sane. So I fenced, or tried to. For one thing, I have had no sleep. I had not one single wink. When I did get between the sheets, all night I lay in agony. I suffered from that worst form of nightmare, the nightmare of the man who is wide awake. There was continually before my fevered eyes the strange figure of that nameless thing. I had often smiled at tales of haunted folk. Here was I, one of them. My feelings were not rendered more agreeable by a strengthening conviction that if I had only retained the normal attitude of a scientific observer, I should in all probability have solved the mystery of my Oriental friend, and that his example of the genus of Copridae might have been pinned, by a very large pin, on a piece, a monstrous piece, of cork. It was galling to reflect that he and I had played together a game of bluff, a game at which civilization was once more proved to be a failure. She could not have seen all this in my face, but she saw something, because her own look softened. You do look tired. She seemed to be casting about in her own mind for a cause. You have been worrying. She glanced around the big laboratory. Have you been spending the night in this wizard's cave? Pretty well. Oh. The monosyllable, as she uttered it, was big with meaning. Uninvited, she seated herself in an armchair, a huge old thing, of shagreen leather, which would have held half a dozen of her. Demure in it she looked, like an agreeable reminiscence, alive and a little up to date, of the woman of long ago. Her dove-grey eyes seemed to perceive so much more than they cared to show. How is it that you have forgotten that you asked me to come? Didn't you mean it? Of course I meant it. Then how is it you've forgotten? I didn't forget. Don't tell fibs. Something is the matter. Tell me what. Is it that I am too early? Nothing of the sort. You couldn't be too early. Thank you. When you pay a compliment, even so one as neat as that, sometimes you should look as if you mean it. It is early. I know it's early. But afterwards I want you to come to lunch. I told Aunt that I would bring you back with me. You are much better to me than I deserve. Perhaps. A tone came into her voice which was almost pathetic. I think that to some men, women are almost better than they deserve. I don't know why. I suppose it pleases them. It is odd. There was a different intonation, a dryness. Have you forgotten what I came for? Not a bit of it. I am not quite the brute I seem. You came to see an illustration of that pleasant little fancy of mine for slaughtering my fellows. The fact is, I'm hardly in a mood for that just now. I've been illustrating it too much already. What do you mean? Well, for one thing, it's been murdering Lessingham's cat. Mr. Lessingham's cat? Then it almost murdered Percy Woodville. Mr. Atherton, I wish you wouldn't talk like that. It's a fact. It was a question of a little matter in the wrong place, and if it hadn't been for something very like a miracle, he'd be dead. I wish you wouldn't have anything to do with such things. I hate them. I stared. Hate them? I thought you'd come to see an illustration. And pray what was your notion of an illustration? Well, another cat would have been killed at least. And do you suppose that I would have sat still while a cat was being killed for my edification? It needn't necessarily have been a cat, but something would have to be killed. How are you going to illustrate the death-dealing propensities of a weapon of that sort without it? Is it possible that you imagine that I came here to see something killed? Then for what did you come? I do not know what there was about the question which was startling, but as soon as it was out she went a fiery red. Because I was a fool. I was bewildered. Either she had got out the wrong side of bed, or I had, or we both had. Here she was, assailing me hammer and tongs, so far as I could see, for absolutely nothing. You were pleased to be satirical at my expense. I should not dare. Your detection of me would be so painfully rapid. I was in no mood for jangling. I turned a little away from her. Immediately she was at my elbow. Mr. Atherton, Miss Grayling, are you cross with me? Why should I be? If it pleases you to laugh at my stupidity, you are completely justified. But you are not stupid. No, nor you satirical. You are not stupid. You know that you are not stupid. It was only stupidity on my part to pretend that you were. It is very good of you to say so, but I fear that I am an indifferent host. Although you would not care for an illustration, there may be other things which you might find amusing. Why do you keep on snubbing me? I keep on snubbing you? You are always snubbing me. You know you are. Sometimes I feel as if I hated you. Miss Grayling, I do. After all, it is only natural. That is how you talk, as if I were a child and you were, I don't know what. Well, Mr. Atherton, I am sorry to be obliged to leave you. I have enjoyed my visit very much. I only hope I have not seemed too intrusive. She flounced. Flounce was the only appropriate word, out of the room before I could stop her. I caught her in the passage. Miss Grayling, I entreat you. Pray do not entreat me, Mr. Atherton. Standing still, she turned to me. I would rather show myself to the door as I showed myself in, but if that is impossible, may I ask you not to speak to me between this and the street? The hint was broad enough, even for me. I escorted her through the hall without a word. In perfect silence she shook the dust of my abode from her feet. I had made a pretty mess of things. I felt it as I stood on the top of the steps and watched her going. She was walking off at 4 miles an hour. I had not even ventured to ask to be allowed to call a hansom. It was beginning to occur to me that this was a case in which another blow upon the river might be, to say the least of it, advisable, and I was just returning to the house with the intention of putting myself into my flannels, when a cab drew up, and old Lindon got out of it. End of chapter 19. Recording by Alan Winterowd. boomcoach.blogspot.com. Chapter 20. A Heavy Father. Mr. Lindon was excited. There is no mistaking it when he is, because with him excitement means perspiration, and as soon as he was out of the cab, he took off his hat and began to wipe the lining. Atherton, I want to speak to you, most particularly, somewhere in private. I took him into my laboratory. It is my rule to take no one there. It is a workshop, not a playroom. The place is private, but recently my rules had become dead letters. Directly he was inside, Lindon began puffing and stewing, wiping his forehead, throwing out his chest as if he were oppressed by a sense of his own importance. Then he started off talking at the top of his voice, and it is not a low one either. Atherton, I've always looked on you as a kind of son. That's very kind of you. I've always regarded you as a level-headed fellow, a man from whom sound advice can be obtained when sound advice is most to be desired. That is also very kind of you. And therefore I make no apology for coming to you at what may be regarded as a strictly domestic crisis. At a moment in the history of the Lindons when delicacy and common sense are essentially required. This time I contented myself with nodding. Already I perceived what was coming. Somehow, when I am with a man, I feel so much more clear-headed than I do when I am with a woman, realize so much better the nature of the ground on which I am standing. What do you know of this man Lessingham? I knew it was coming. What all the world knows. And what does all the world know of him? I ask you that. A flashy, plausible, shallow-pated carpet-bagger. That is what all the world knows of him. The man's a political adventurer. He snatches a precarious and criminal notoriety by trading on the follies of his fellow countrymen. He is devoid of decency, destitute of principle, and impervious to all the feelings of a gentleman. What do you know of him besides this?" "I am not prepared to admit that I do know that." "Oh, yes, you do. Don't talk nonsense. You chose to screen the fellow. I say what I mean. I always have said, and I always shall say. What do you know of him outside politics, of his family, of his private life?" "Well, not very much." "Of course you don't, nor does anybody else. The man's a mushroom, or a toadstool, rather, sprung up in the course of a single night, apparently out of some dirty ditch. Why, sir, not only is he without ordinary intelligence, he was even without a Brummagem substitute for manners." He had worked himself into a state of heat, in which his countenance presented a not too agreeable assortment of scarlets and purples. He flung himself into a chair, threw his coat wide open and his arms too, and started off again. "The family of the Lindens is, at the present, represented by a young woman, by my daughter, sir. She represents me, and it's her duty to represent me adequately, sir. And what's more, between ourselves, sir, it's her duty to marry. My property is my own, and I wouldn't have it passed to either of my confounded brothers on any account. They're next door to fools, and they don't represent me in any possible sense of the word. My daughter, sir, can marry whom she pleases. There's no one in England, peer or commoner, who would not esteem it an honour to have her for his wife. I've told her so. Yes, sir, I've told her, though you'd think that she, of all the people in the world, wouldn't require telling. Yet what do you think she does? She actually carries on what I can't help calling a compromising acquaintance with this man Lessingham. No. But I say yes, and I wish to heaven I didn't. I've warned her against the scoundrel more than once. I've told her to cut him dead. And yet, as you saw yourself last night in the face of the assembled House of Commons, after that twiddling claptrap speech of his, in which there was not one sound sentiment, nor an idea which would hold water, she positively went away with him, in the most ostentatious and disgraceful fashion, on his arm, and actually snubbed her father. It is monstrous that a father, should be subjected to such treatment by his child." The poor old boy polished his brow with his pocket handkerchief. "When I got home, I told her what I thought of her, I promise you that. And I told her what I thought of him. I didn't mince my words with her. There are occasions when plain speaking is demanded, and that was one. I positively forbade her to speak to the fellow again, or to recognize him if she met him in the street. I pointed out to her, with perfect candour, that the fellow was an infernal scoundrel, that and nothing else, and that he would bring disgrace on whoever came in contact with him, even with the end of a barge pole. And what do you think she said?" "She promised to obey you, I make no doubt." "Did she, sir? By gad, did she? That shows how much you know her. She said, and by gad, by her manner and the way she went on, you'd have thought she was the parent and I was the child. She said that I grieved her, and that she was disappointed in me, that times have changed. Yes, sir, she said that times have changed, that nowadays parents weren't Russian autocrats. No, sir, not Russian autocrats. That she was sorry she couldn't oblige me. Yes, sir, that was how she put it. She was sorry she couldn't oblige me, but it was altogether out of the question to suppose that she could put a period to a friendship which she valued, simply on account of my unreasonable prejudices, and in short, she told me to go to the devil, sir." "And did you—" I was on the point of asking him if he went, but I checked myself in time. "Let us look at the matter as men of the world. What do you know against Lessingham apart from his politics?" "That's just it. I know nothing." "In a sense, isn't that in his favour?" "I don't see how you make that out. I don't mind telling you that I've had inquiries made. He's not been in the House 6 years. This is his second Parliament. He's jumped up like a jack-in-the-box. His first constituency was Harwich. They've got him still, and much good may he do 'em. But how he came to stand for the place, or who, or what, or where he was before he stood for the place, no one seems to have the faintest notion. Hasn't he been a great traveller? I never heard of it. Not in the East? Has he told you so? No, I was only wondering. Well, it seems to me that to find out that nothing is known against him is something in his favour. My dear Sydney, don't talk nonsense. What it proves is simply that he is a nothing, and a nobody. Had he been anything or anyone, something would have been known about him, either for or against. I don't want my daughter to marry a man who's shot up through a trap, simply because nothing is known against him. Hang me if I wouldn't 10 times sooner she should marry you. When he said that, my heart leapt into my bosom. I had to turn away. I am afraid that is out of the question. He stopped in his tramping and looked at me askance. Why? I felt that, if I was not careful, I should be done for, and probably in his present mood, Marjorie too. My dear Linden, I cannot tell you how grateful I am to you for your suggestion, but I can only repeat that, unfortunately, anything of the kind is out of the question. I don't see why. Perhaps not. You're a pretty lot, upon my word. I'm afraid we are. I want you to tell her that Lessingham is a damned scoundrel. I see. But I would suggest that if I am to use the influence with which you credit me to the best advantage, or to preserve a shred of it, I had hardly better state the fact quite so bluntly as that. I don't care how you state it as you like. Only, I want you to soak her mind with a loathing of the fellow. I want you to paint him in his true colours. In fact, I want you to choke him off. While he still struggled with his words, and with the perspiration on his brow, Edwards entered. I turned to him. What is it? Mrs. Linden, sir, wishes to see you particularly and at once. At that moment I found the announcement a trifle perplexing. It delighted Linden. He began to stutter and to stammer. The very thing. Couldn't have been better. Show her in here. Hide me somewhere. I don't care where. Behind that screen. You use your influence with her. Give her a good talking to. Tell her what I've told you, and at the critical moment I'll come in, and then if we can't manage her between us, it'll be a wonder. The proposition staggered me. But, my dear Mr. Linden, I fear that I cannot. He cut me short. Here she comes. Ere I could stop him, he was behind the screen. I had not seen him move with such agility before. And before I could expostulate, Marjorie was in the room. Something which was in her bearing, in her face, in her eyes, quickened the beating of my pulses. She looked as if something had come into her life and taken the joy clean out of it. End of chapter 20. Recording by Alan Winterout. Boomcoach.blogspot.com